At this very moment, Putin is begging for peace. Russia is preparing an agreement to end the war. The dictator is being pushed to choose, but there's a catch. Zelensky has cornered Moscow. Insiders info straight from the heart of Russia. Russians are ready to sign a peace agreement on Kyiv's terms. You won't believe it. Has Budanov swayed the Americans to Ukraine's side? So that's why Washington has changed its rhetoric. They are already talking about it openly. A new fist of power? Crimea is plunging into darkness. Sevastopol was the first to give in. You'll be shocked by what has started on the peninsula. And all of this is happening right now. Hello, I'm Daryna Gutskalo, and we're getting started. Urgent. Russia has finally given the bloody dictator the right speech text. Putin stated that he is ready for negotiations with Ukraine.
Russia is ready for peace talks with Ukraine, based on the agreements reached back in Istanbul. I see no reason to deviate from these agreements on our part. Based on the agreements reached in Istanbul, the modalities discussed in Anchorage, and most importantly, the realities on the ground.
However, there is a catch here. In this way, Putin has once again pulled out old files with his dreams of Ukraine's surrender. The Kremlin continues to push a scenario where Kiev must cede territories, weaken its army, and accept the aggressor's terms, including leaving the occupied territories of Donbas and Crimea to Russia. The fate of the remaining lands is to be decided at a personal meeting between Volodymyr Zelensky and Putin. In turn, the Anchorage principles, as understood by the Kremlin, involve the full withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from Donbas and freezing the front line in other regions. However, the Russians themselves don't particularly share their president's views.
I really want the president to provide clarity, because so far the only response has been diplomats' proposals to resume negotiations with Kiev.
To avoid losing face completely before his own people, the dictator once again began telling tales about the real situation at the front and Kiev's supposedly weak positions. It seems the reality in the bunker continues to exist separately from the events on the battlefield. And then came the decisive moment. Kiev is issuing a direct challenge to Moscow. Zelensky stated that the time has come for real negotiations to end the war without imitations, ultimatums, or Kremlin manipulations.
Already the majority in Russia is complaining to Putin that there's no end in sight to his war, and all the current hardships for Russians should bring them closer to the thought that their war exists. And it's not just stones from the sky. And that their war must end.
Has the moment really come when the fate of the war is being decided? We're keeping our finger on the pulse. In the West, a new emphasis is suddenly emerging on a key figure. And we're not talking about Trump, Macron, or Putin. Influential American analysts believe Kirill Budanov could be a key architect of a future settlement to the war. This opinion was expressed by the insider journalist Michael Weiss and former CIA officer Mark Polymeropoulos.
The fact that he's now in a political post in the presidential administration, not just in intelligence. So he'll be the person who determines any future settlement of this war.
Michael Weiss noted that in Washington, Budanov is seen as one of the most authoritative Ukrainian representatives in the security sector.
This is a man who has been very close to the Americans. And when he comes here as part of any delegation led by Zelensky and meets with the CIA, he's an old friend to them.
So, could Kirill Budanov really become one of the key figures in the future end of the war? We're following the developments. Meanwhile, Ukraine's defense forces are pushing forward. The so-called action on the territory of the temporarily occupied peninsula seems to be just beginning. Ukrainian drones spent all night encircling Simferopol, Sevastopol, and Kerch. According to monitoring channels, the harvest of strikes today is more bountiful than ever before. Crimea saw potential hits on Kirovsky's railway station, Simferopol's power plant, warehouses of the 133rd Logistics Brigade of the Russian Black Sea Fleet in Bakhchisarai, a military camp near Kerch, and the Sevastopol substation powering the whole city. We didn't have to wait long for the results of the strikes. Sevastopol has officially entered blackout mode.
Dear residents of Sevastopol, as a result of an enemy attack on our energy infrastructure, the city is temporarily without power. The enemy is again launching treacherous strikes, trying to deprive us of our normal life and so panic. A special regime has been introduced at the facilities. Specialists are assessing the damage and doing everything possible to restore the light.
More proof that the air shield over the peninsula has turned into a leaky sieve. Ukraine's defense forces feel free on the territory of Crimea, so to be continued. The West is showering Ukraine with weapons. The Netherlands and Germany are putting their trump cards on the table. Arsenals with those same fierce beasts are opening on command. The British are preparing another surprise for the AFU, which Moscow certainly won't want to see in action. And that's not all the bad news for the enemy. While the Kremlin churns out propaganda, Ukraine churns out the weapons of victory. Kyiv is rapidly becoming one of the world's main centers for military innovation. More on this in our report coming up next. What the Kremlin has feared for years could soon become a reality. The West isn't just maintaining military support for Ukraine, it's starting production on a new generation of long-range missiles. And if these defense company plans are realized, the Ukrainian army could receive hundreds or even thousands of high-precision strike weapons.
The first wake-up call for Moscow came with news from the Netherlands. They announced funding for the production of 700 long-range cruise missiles from Destinus specifically for Ukraine. And that's just one program. Meanwhile, reports continue to circulate about Ukraine using new long-range AQRAM missiles with a range of over 930 kilometers. But that's not even the most interesting part. Some estimates suggest future deliveries won't just be small batches, but on a scale reaching into the thousands. For the Russian military command, this prospect looks like a strategic nightmare. While they used to hide depots, headquarters, and factories deep in the rear, the very concept of a safe distance is now starting to crumble. From Belgorod to the Urals, from airfields to defense plants, everything is gradually falling into the potential danger zone. But the real intrigue is unfolding in the United Kingdom. Defense giant MBDA has announced successful tests of its new crossbow missile drone. What's most painful for the Kremlin isn't even the 800-kilometer range or the 300-kilogram warhead. The speed of development is what's truly striking. It took only 9 months to go from an initial idea to a finished prototype. The British have shown that modern precision weapons can be built faster than Russian officials can write reports claiming they have no equal. And the crossbow is just one part of a much larger story. Under the British Breakstop project, several other long-range systems are being developed simultaneously. For instance, the Tiger Shark can hit targets up to 1,000 kilometers away with a 300-kilogram warhead costing just over $500,000, a budget option by modern standards. Even more impressive is the Skylance, with a reported range of up to 1,200 kilometers. There's one detail that makes this situation particularly interesting. All these systems are being built to be ITAR-free. Simply put, they contain no American components that could restrict their transfer to other countries. The British intentionally designed these missiles so they could be sent to Ukraine quickly and without bureaucratic hurdles. This is a very troubling signal for the Kremlin. They have fewer and fewer political levers left to block such deliveries. The most symbolic change is the shift in the West's overall approach. While allies once debated sending single artillery pieces, they're now discussing joint production, long-term funding, and entire lines of long-range weapons tailored specifically for Ukraine's needs. A new defense ecosystem is effectively taking shape, where Ukraine is no longer just an aid recipient, but a key hub for future European security. It's funny that Putin started this war under the slogans of demilitarizing Ukraine. A few years have passed, and now Ukraine is gaining access to technologies it could only dream of before. The West is launching new production lines, funding hundreds and thousands of long-range systems. If these programs are implemented even partially, then for many Russian facilities, the coming years may turn out to be much less peaceful than the Kremlin is used to expecting. For Russians, nighttime alerts are becoming as much a part of daily life as their morning coffee. Before Moscow could even recover from the previous attacks, the sky over Russia and the occupied territories was once again filled with the sounds of explosions and sirens. It all looked most symbolic right in the Russian capital. While officials reported on more successful interceptions, drones flew over the Moscow region one after another. Mayor Sergei Sobyanin spent the night counting new targets approaching the city, practically in real time. According to him, nearly 60 drones were allegedly shot down on the outskirts of Moscow. The irony is that the more such reports appear, the harder it is for Russians to believe the fairy tales about the capital's absolute safety. Powerful explosions were also heard in Bryansk.
Holy shit. I'm fucking shocked. That's something.
According to local sources, railway infrastructure was hit, one of the key arteries through which Russian military logistics are supplied. For the Kremlin, this is a particularly painful topic because while generals dream of new offensives, more and more facilities in the rear are forced to think not about transporting cargo but about their own survival. It was no less intense in occupied Crimea. Explosions were heard there in several areas of the peninsula at once. The Tavriiska thermal power plant near Simferopol drew particular attention, one of the key energy facilities that Russia once built as a symbol of the final integration of occupied Crimea into its own system. Now, this symbol is increasingly appearing in the news due to damage, fires, and the consequences of attacks, after previous strikes, burnt-out structures, holes, and serious destruction had already been recorded there. Events in Armyansk unfolded in an even more interesting way. According to preliminary information, the strike hit the building of the FSB border service near the railway station. A fire broke out after the explosion, and witnesses reported further detonations. When security forces' facilities start exploding, even the most staunch supporters of Kremlin TV shows suddenly begin asking very uncomfortable questions about the effectiveness of the entire defense system. Reports of explosions also came from Donetsk and Berdyansk. In the latter, the area of the railway station drew particular attention where a fire broke out after the attack. And this once again demonstrates one simple trend. The geography of the strikes is constantly expanding, and the list of facilities that the Russian authorities considered relatively safe is rapidly shrinking. The final statistics from the Russian Ministry of Defense are particularly telling. They claim that 301 Ukrainian drones were allegedly shot down in a single night. And here a rather awkward paradox arises. If the threat is truly so massive that they must report hundreds of targets over dozens of regions, then Russia itself is effectively admitting that the air war has long since expanded far beyond the front lines. And while Kremlin officials continue to talk about having the situation under control, Russian regions are increasingly waking up not to alarm clocks, but to explosions. And it seems that for many residents of Russia, this is becoming a new, very unpleasant reality. This is a true geopolitical shift. Volodymyr Zelensky has finally found the right words for Lukashenko. Ukraine has set a firm deadline and made it clear that Kyiv is not joking. Minsk is pulling back its mouthpieces and shielding Moscow's ignorance. Performative gestures on live TV, unexpected apologies from Lukashenko. What's more, Belarus is trying to cozy up to Ukraine as a friend. What could such a change in Minsk's rhetoric ultimately signify? As the old man decided to sign the surrender document for both himself and Putin? Let's take a look. In Minsk, they are slamming the panic button as hard as they can. Lukashenko, who for years tried to look like a formidable ally of the Kremlin and regularly threatened his neighbors with every possible punishment, has gone suspiciously quiet in recent days. Following Volodymyr Zelensky's tough statements regarding Belarusian involvement in facilitating Russian attacks from its territory, official Minsk has unexpectedly shifted into a mode of cautious excuses and performative peacefulness. It is particularly interesting to see how the Belarusian authorities have suddenly begun to emphasize that they are not participating in the war. The first signal was a strange incident involving a statement by Sergei Lavrov. Belarusian state media unexpectedly cut the most aggressive part of his quote, which claimed that those trying to drag Belarus into the war would face dire consequences. All that remained was the convenient phrase that Minsk is allegedly not participating in the conflict. It seems as though those in Belarusian offices have suddenly decided that bellicose rhetoric might now bring more trouble than benefit. The second warning sign came from Defense Minister Viktor Crimean, the same official who, at the start of the full-scale invasion, claimed there were no threats to Ukraine from Belarusian territory, is now actively explaining that it makes no sense for Belarus to get involved in the war. Until recently, Minsk loved to showcase missiles, drills, and aggressive statements, but now the main message has become, "We don't want to fight at all." It seems the rhetoric has shifted so abruptly that even the propagandists can't always keep up with the new party line. A third signal came from the Secretary of the Security Council of Belarus, Alexander Volfovich. He also suddenly began talking about the need to end the war as quickly as possible and about Minsk's desire to avoid any involvement in the conflict. And here a rather amusing contrast emerges. Just recently, a serious-looking Lukashenko was flaunting nuclear ambitions and speaking of his readiness to respond to any challenges. But now, official Minsk increasingly resembles someone who was shouting insults over a fence, only to suddenly realize the gate had been left wide open. The problem for the Belarusian leadership is that statements alone can no longer fix the situation, as Ukraine and the West see the reality clearly. The Belarusian military-industrial complex works in the interests of the Russian war machine. Part of the logistics is provided through the country's territory, and the infrastructure is used to support Russian operations. Therefore, the current campaign about the reluctance to fight looks more like an attempt to urgently distance themselves from possible consequences than a real policy change. And if before Lukashenko could afford to play the role of the Kremlin's loudest ally, now the situation looks different. In Minsk, it seems they understand better and better. The longer the war lasts, the more expensive participation becomes, even in indirect forms of support for Russia. Therefore, the Belarusian authorities today resemble a passenger who for many years sat happily next to the driver, but now suddenly began to nervously ask if it's time to get out of the car. The only question is whether it's too late for Minsk to start thinking about this. And this is exactly where it becomes clear why Minsk suddenly started talking so much about peace and the reluctance to fight. Volodymyr Zelensky publicly presented Lukashenko with a bill for years of indirect participation in the war on the side of the Kremlin. And it's no longer about political statements or diplomatic courtesies, but about very specific objects. The president of Ukraine reported 4 Russian repeaters in the Gomel and Brest regions, which are used to coordinate Russian drone attacks on Ukrainian cities. According to Zelensky, through these systems, the enemy attacked the Zhytomyr, Rivne, and Volyn regions, as well as energy and railway infrastructure facilities. In other words, while Minsk was talking about its neutrality, Russian drones were receiving help from Belarusian territory for more accurate guidance on Ukrainian targets. And now Kyiv is saying directly, it's time to decide. Zelensky emphasized the Ukrainian side has repeatedly passed information to Minsk through intelligence and other channels. In simple words, first there were warnings behind closed doors, then there were signals, and now the public stage has begun. And it was after this that a real campaign about non-participation in the war and reluctance to get involved in the conflict suddenly began in the Belarusian information space. The president's phrase that Lukashenko's next apologies no longer interest anyone sounded particularly harsh because over the years of war, Kyiv has learned to evaluate actions, not words. And the actions look quite eloquent. Belarusian enterprises work for the Russian military-industrial complex. Fuel continues to flow to the Russian army, and technical infrastructure is used for attacks on Ukrainian cities. Ukraine has effectively issued an ultimatum: the repeaters must be dismantled. Moreover, either Belarus itself can do it, or Ukraine will solve the problem on its own. The formula sounded as simple as possible, either them or us. And judging by the nervous activity of Belarusian officials in recent days, Minsk understood perfectly well that this time it is no longer about another diplomatic exchange of statements. So it is possible that all this sudden peacefulness of Belarusian officials has a very prosaic explanation. After years of playing, we're not exactly fighting, but we're helping. Lukashenko was directly told for the first time, the era of half measures is ending. And now Minsk faces a choice that is becoming increasingly difficult to put off for later. What the Kremlin tried to hide has finally come to light. The dictator's fear for his life has reached its absolute peak. Paranoia is making itself known. The bunker dweller's world collapsed right before his eyes. They won't be able to invent longevity for the dictator after all. Health problems are knocking him off his feet. Ultimately, what will finish Putin off? A host of old illnesses or an inner circle ready to push him into the abyss? Let's see. Putin wants to live forever. It seems his greatest fear isn't NATO, sanctions, or even Ukrainian drones. His greatest enemy is time. And while the Russian economy suffocates under the weight of war, the master of the Kremlin himself seems to be waging his own war against aging and death. According to Western media, tens of billions of dollars have already been spent on longevity projects in Russia. Gene therapy, growing human organs in animals, bioprinting living tissues, experiments with cell rejuvenation. It all sounds more like a sci-fi thriller than a state program for a country at war and facing economic hardship. It seems the Kremlin is more concerned with repairing its own ruler than with the future of its own citizens. Of particular note is the fact that for years Putin has publicly admired the idea of near-infinite life. He talks about organ replacement, body rejuvenation, and future technologies with such enthusiasm as if he plans to personally test their effectiveness over the next few centuries. And talk of bare-chested ice baths and cryochambers only adds a touch of desperate struggle against the relentless calendar to this image. However, the more the Kremlin talks about defeating aging, the more questions arise. Critics point out there are many loud claims, but far fewer convincing results. Some even suggest that scientists are simply telling the Russian leader what he wants to hear. After all, when you're over 70 and don't want to let go of power, the prospect of outsmarting death becomes extremely attractive. The irony is that while Putin seeks a recipe for immortality, his appearance is increasingly becoming the subject of new rumors and discussions. Instead of the image of an eternal ruler, the world increasingly sees a man desperately trying to prove to nature that its laws don't apply to him. But history has shown time and again, death can be ignored, delayed, or feared, but no one has ever managed to sign a lifelong contract with it. Talk of Putin's health problems has been circulating for many years. He is regularly attributed with a wide variety of diagnoses, from neurological diseases to oncology. Official Moscow, as always, categorically denies everything, but videos and photos repeatedly provide new reasons for discussion. Whether it's Putin gripping a table too tightly during a meeting as if it's the last pillar of stability, or moving so cautiously as if every step requires approval from a special Kremlin commission, Putin's latest appearance at the parade in Moscow has sparked a new wave of questions. British journalists have pointed out that the Russian dictator looked noticeably exhausted, aged, and unnaturally bloated. Social media immediately erupted in discussion, and users began to wonder if the ceremonial uniform was hiding the increasingly obvious problems of the Kremlin's master. The Daily Mail notes that this time even a carefully prepared television image could not completely mask the changes in the Russian leader's appearance. The man who for years was portrayed as a symbol of strength and control increasingly gives the impression of a politician burdened by the weight of his own decisions. And the longer the war continues, the harder it is to hide the fatigue behind official ceremonies and grand speeches.
A short, frail old man, bending under the weight of a burden he can no longer lift. Either Putin himself is afraid, or he is being provoked and intimidated in this way, leading to his fear and paranoia. He looks lonely and isolated in his security bubble.
A wave of rumors swept the Kremlin after photos of the dictator's hands leaked online. In the released footage, veins, dry skin, and sharply defined tendons were clearly visible. Online theories immediately began to form, and experts and commentators once again spoke about possible health problems of the man who for over 25 years has tried to look like an eternal ruler.
There is clearly something wrong with Putin's hands. Besides being elbow-deep in blood, the veins on them are also very noticeably swollen.
But this is far from the first episode. Previously, footage from Putin's meeting with Donald Trump also caused a heated discussion when users noticed his unsteady gait. On social media, people joked then that the Russian president's legs looked as if they had long wanted to retire before their owner. From time to time, much more serious assumptions surface. Various leaks and unofficial reports have featured versions of oncological diseases or Parkinson's disease. There is no evidence for such claims, but rumors continue to live a life of their own and regularly return to the information space.
I can confirm that he has been diagnosed with an early stage of Parkinson's disease, but it is progressing. Putin is regularly given potent drugs and pain-killing injections.
At the same time, other observers call for not looking for sensations where there may be ordinary age-related changes. After decades in power and endless attempts to maintain the image of an eternal leader, even the most carefully constructed image is beginning to crack. And perhaps this is the main paradox of the whole story. The man who for decades tried to create an image of an all-powerful and irreplaceable ruler today increasingly resembles a man fighting an unequal battle with his own age. Billions for longevity experiments, talk of organ replacement, and dreams of an almost endless life look like an attempt to outplay humanity's oldest rival, time. But while Kremlin scientists search for the recipe for immortality, the calendar continues to relentlessly turn the pages, and it seems that it is this opponent that makes Putin much more nervous than NATO sanctions or even Ukrainian drones. On this note, we conclude our broadcast. We're continuing right now. Stay tuned for the latest news so we can bring it to you first. Don't forget to subscribe. See you soon!